You think the Vikings conquered England? Every video on this channel has shown you the power of the Norse war machine, Ragnar's sons, the Great Heathen Army, Ivar the Boneless, kingdom after kingdom falling like dominoes. Northumbria gone, East Anglia gone, Mercia gone. By 878 AD, there was only one English kingdom left standing. One. And the man defending it was hiding in a swamp. Not a warrior king on a throne. Not a legendary commander rallying his armies. A sick, exhausted, defeated man crouching in the marshes of Somerset with a handful of survivors, eating whatever he could scavenge, watching the smoke rise from the villages the Vikings had just burned. Everything was lost. His army was scattered. His people had surrendered. His own nobles had switched sides. This was Alfred, the last king of the last English kingdom. And according to every logical calculation, he should have been dead within weeks. But he wasn't, because what happened next is the greatest military comeback in medieval history. And the Vikings never saw it coming. Today you'll discover 3 things that will change how you see the entire Viking Age. First, how Alfred went from a hiding fugitive, eating burned cakes in a peasant's hut, to commanding a unified English army in less than 3 months. Second, the single battle at Edington, where Alfred crushed the Great Heathen Army so completely that their leader Guthrum begged for mercy and agreed to be baptized as a Christian. And third, the revolutionary fortress system Alfred built afterward that made England permanently unconquerable and changed the future of Western civilization forever. The Vikings had never lost. Not like this, and not to a man they had already defeated. Picture England in 878 AD. Not the England you know. There was no England. There were 4 separate kingdoms: Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and Wessex. And the Vikings had devoured 3 of them in just over a decade. The Great Heathen Army that Ivar the Boneless had led across the sea had done what no force in history had managed. It had brought the Anglo-Saxon world to its knees. Only Wessex remained. And Wessex was breaking. The man standing between the complete Viking conquest of the English-speaking world and total extinction was not a born warrior. He was the 5th son of a king. He was never supposed to rule. He spent his childhood reading books, not swinging swords. He suffered from a mysterious illness that left him bedridden for days at a time. And yet, this man, this unlikely or underestimated chronically ill scholar, would become the only English monarch in history to earn the title, the Great. Alfred was born in 849 AD in the royal estate of Wantage, the 5th and youngest son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex. 5th son. In 9th century England, that meant one thing: you would never be king. The throne would pass through your 4 older brothers long before it ever reached you. Your destiny was the church, or a minor lordship, or irrelevance. But Alfred's father did something unusual. When Alfred was just 4 years old, Ethelwulf sent the boy to Rome. Not on a pilgrimage. He sent a 4-year-old child across Europe to be received by the Pope himself. The Pope anointed Alfred and dressed him in the robes of a Roman consul. A symbolic gesture, but symbols matter when they're burned into a child's memory at that age. Why would a king send his youngest, least important son to Rome? Was it religious devotion, political strategy, or did Ethelwulf see something in his smallest boy that he didn't see in the other 4? The answer died with him, but the effect on Alfred was permanent. The boy returned to England carrying something none of his warrior brothers possessed, a vision of a world beyond Wessex. He had seen Rome. He had walked through the ruins of an empire. He understood, even as a child, that civilizations could be built and civilizations could fall, and that knowledge would save England. While his brothers trained with swords and shields, Alfred trained with books, and he learned to read Latin at a time when most English kings couldn't read their own language. He memorized Saxon poetry. He studied the writings of the early church fathers. His mother, according to the famous account, held up a beautifully decorated book of Saxon poems and promised it to whichever son could memorize it first. Alfred won, not because he was the oldest or the strongest, because he wanted it more. But here's the detail that changes everything about Alfred's story. He was sick, constantly, mysteriously, debilitatingly sick. The historical sources describe a condition that struck him with severe abdominal pain, periods of complete exhaustion, and episodes so crippling he couldn't stand. Modern historians have debated the diagnosis for centuries. Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome, kidney stones, even psychosomatic illness triggered by stress. Whatever it was, it meant that Alfred lived his entire life in pain. Every decision he made, every battle he fought, every law he wrote, he did it while his own body was trying to destroy him from the inside. Was that weakness? His brothers certainly thought so. A sick bookworm in a family of warriors, the runt who read poems while real men fought Danes. But sickness teaches something that health never can. It teaches you that strength is not permanent. That power can be taken from you in an instant. That the only things that endure are the things you build with your mind, not the things you take with your sword. Alfred's brothers didn't learn that lesson, and one by one, the Vikings killed them all. Ethelred, his oldest surviving brother, died fighting the Danes in 871. Before him, his other brothers had fallen to battle, illness, and the relentless grinding pressure of defending a kingdom against an enemy that never stopped coming. In just a few years, every man who stood between Alfred and the throne was gone. The fifth son, the sick one, the reader, the boy who was never supposed to rule. He was now the last hope of the last English kingdom, and the Great Heathen Army was already at his door. Alfred became King of Wessex in 871 AD. He was 22 years old, and he inherited a nightmare. The Great Heathen Army, the same force that Ivar the Boneless had led across the sea to avenge Ragnar Lothbrok, had spent 5 years systematically dismantling Anglo-Saxon England. Northumbria had fallen. Its king had been executed. East Anglia had collapsed. King Edmund had been captured and killed, according to legend, subjected to the blood eagle or shot full of arrows until he resembled a hedgehog. Mercia was crumbling, its king reduced to a Viking puppet. 3 kingdoms destroyed. Only Wessex remained, and Alfred's first year as king was a catastrophe. He fought 9 major battles against the Danes in his first 12 months on the throne. 9. Not campaigns spread over years. 9 pitched engagements in a single year. Each one bleeding his army thinner. Each one pushing Wessex closer to the same fate as its neighbors. He won some. He lost more. The Danes kept coming. They always kept coming. That was their strategy. Not to win one decisive battle, but to exhaust you, to bleed you, to fight until you had nothing left. Alfred survived that first year by doing something his pride should have prevented. He paid them to leave. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it plainly. Wessex bought peace, silver, in exchange for the Danes withdrawing to other territory. It was humiliating. A king paying his enemies to stop killing his people. His warriors must have been furious. His nobles must have questioned whether this sick bookworm had the spine to lead them. But Alfred wasn't buying peace. He was buying time. And this is where the Scholar King proved he was more dangerous than any warrior. During the fragile years of bought peace between 872 and 877, Alfred did something no English king had ever done. He studied the enemy, not their weapons or their armor. He studied how they thought. He analyzed their strategy. He mapped their patterns. He noted that the Vikings always attacked in winter when Anglo-Saxon armies disbanded to tend their farms. He observed that they used rivers as highways, sailing deep inland before anyone could mount a defense. He catalogued their preference for capturing fortified towns and using them as bases. Every weakness, every pattern, every predictable behavior. Alfred filed it away like a scholar, cataloguing manuscripts, except these manuscripts would be used to build a war machine. He began quietly reorganizing Wessex's defenses. He divided his fyrd, the citizen militia, into two rotating halves so that one group could fight while the other farmed. He started planning a network of fortified towns, burghs, positioned so that no point in Wessex would be more than a day's march from a defensive stronghold. None of this was dramatic. None of it made for heroic stories around the fire. It was administrative, bureaucratic, and the work of a mind that understood that wars are won not by the strongest sword, but by the best system. But before Alfred could finish building his system, the Vikings struck again, and this time they came to end it. In January 878, a Danish warlord named Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack on Wessex. The timing was deliberate and devastating. It was Twelfth Night, a Christian feast day, and Alfred's forces were scattered across the kingdom celebrating. Guthrum moved fast, striking the royal estate at Chippenham with overwhelming force. Alfred's army shattered. His nobles fled or surrendered. The kingdom of Wessex, the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom, collapsed in a single night. And Alfred ran, not to another fortress, not to an allied kingdom. There were no allied kingdoms left. He fled into the Somerset levels, a vast, trackless swamp of bogs, marshes, and flooded woodland in the southwest of England. A place where no army could follow, because no army could survive there. The King of Wessex was now a fugitive in a swamp. His kingdom was gone. His army was gone. His people believed he was dead. And this is where every other king in history would have surrendered, fled overseas, or died. But Alfred did something that defied every expectation. Something that would take the most powerful Viking army in the world completely by surprise. Part 4. Main climax/title event. The Somerset levels. In the winter of 878 were not a refuge. They were a death sentence. Freezing water standing knee-deep across miles of flat marshland. Dense fog that never fully lifted. Islands of solid ground connected by paths that only locals knew. Paths that disappeared when the water rose. Wolves, cold, that crept into your bones and stayed there. A landscape designed by nature to swallow anyone foolish enough to enter without knowing its secrets. Alfred entered it with almost nothing. A handful of loyal warriors, no supply chain, no communication with the rest of his kingdom. The man who had studied books in warm halls was now sleeping in mud. eating whatever could be hunted or begged from the scattered marsh dwellers who lived in this forgotten corner of England. And this is where the most famous legend about Alfred was born. According to the story recorded in the earliest biographies, Alfred took shelter in a peasant woman's home. She didn't recognize him as the king. She was baking cakes over the fire and asked Alfred to watch them while she stepped away. Alfred, consumed by his thoughts, his mind churning with strategy and despair, let the cakes burn. The woman returned and scolded him furiously, screaming at the King of England for being too useless to watch bread. Is the story true? Probably not in its details, but the image it creates is devastatingly accurate. The king of the last English kingdom reduced to being yelled at by a peasant for burning food. That's how far he had fallen. That's how total the Viking victory appeared to be. But here's what Guthrum didn't understand about Alfred. The swamp wasn't a tomb. It was a cocoon. Because while Guthrum celebrated his conquest, while his warriors settled into Chippenham and divided Wessex among themselves, while the Anglo-Saxon nobility surrendered and accepted Danish rule, Alfred was doing what he did best. He was thinking, planning, building something in the darkness that no one could see. First, he established a base, a fortified position on the Isle of Athelney, a patch of solid ground deep in the marshes, surrounded by water and accessible only by hidden paths. Not a castle, not a fortress, a mud and timber camp on a swamp island, but it was defensible, and it was invisible. Then he began sending messages, riders slipping out of the marshes at night, carrying word to the scattered thegns and ealdormen of Wessex. Alfred is alive. Alfred has a plan. Alfred is calling the Fyrd. How? How do you reassemble a shattered army when your kingdom is occupied, your nobles have surrendered, and your enemy controls every road and every town, and the logistics alone seem impossible? But Alfred had spent years building relationships with his regional commanders. He had reorganized the Fyrd system so that it could be activated locally without centralized orders. He had created a network of loyal men who knew where to gather when the signal came. The signal came in May 878, less than 4 months after fleeing into the swamp. Alfred sent word to 3 shires, Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. The meeting point was Egbert's Stone, a landmark on the eastern edge of Selwood Forest. The message was simple: come now, bring everyone. And they came. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes what happened at Egbert's Stone with a brevity that tells you the chronicler was struggling to believe it himself. The men of 3 shires gathered at the stone, and when they saw Alfred alive, standing, commanding, they wept with joy. They had believed their king was dead. They had believed Wessex was finished. And now he was standing before them, calling them to war. Alfred marched the reassembled Fyrd directly toward Guthrum's position. No hesitation. No elaborate flanking maneuvers, no time for complex strategy. He had one chance, one army, and one shot at saving everything. They met at Edington, a place in Wiltshire, open ground, the kind of battlefield that favored the larger, more experienced force. And Guthrum's Vikings were both larger and more experienced, but Alfred had something Guthrum didn't. He had men fighting for survival, not for silver, not for land, for the existence of their families, their language, their faith, their civilization. Every man in Alfred's shield wall knew that if they lost this battle, there would be no more England, no second chance, no bought peace. This was the end or the beginning. The Battle of Edington was not a skirmish. It was a full-scale engagement. Shield wall against shield wall, the oldest and most brutal form of combat in the medieval world. Two lines of men pressing against each other with shields and spears, pushing, stabbing, grinding. The men in the front ranks crushed between the force of their own side and the force of the enemy. No room to swing a sword, no room to retreat, just pressure and iron and the screams of men being compressed to death. Alfred held the center of his line, the king himself in the shield wall, not behind it, not watching from a hill. In it, the sick bookworm who was never supposed to be king, pressing his shield against the Danish line with the same desperate strength as every farmer and thegn beside him. The battle lasted hours. The sources don't give us a detailed blow-by-blow. What they give us is the result. The Danish line broke. Guthrum's army, the Great Heathen Army, the force that had conquered 3 English kingdoms, the most feared military machine in 9th century Europe, broke and ran from the field at Edington. They fled to their fortress at Chippenham with Alfred's army pursuing them. Alfred surrounded the fortress. He didn't storm it. He didn't need to. He sealed every exit and waited. For 2 weeks, the Danes sat inside their walls with dwindling food and no hope of reinforcement. The hunters had become the hunted. After 14 days, Guthrum surrendered. But Alfred didn't execute him. He didn't enslave him. Though he didn't even exile him. Alfred made a demand that was more devastating to the Viking identity than any battlefield defeat. He demanded that Guthrum be baptized as a Christian, and Guthrum agreed. The Viking warlord who had conquered half of England knelt in a river and let Alfred's priests pour water over his head. Alfred himself stood as Guthrum's godfather, the symbolic father of his enemy's spiritual rebirth. The man who had nearly destroyed England was now, in the eyes of Christian law, Alfred's son. Was it mercy? Was it genius? Was it the most sophisticated political move of the 9th century? It was all three, because Alfred understood something that no Viking and no English king before him had grasped. You don't defeat an enemy by killing him. You defeat him by absorbing him, by making his identity disappear inside yours. To Guthrum was given the Christian name Ethelstan. He was given East Anglia to rule under Alfred's authority. The Treaty of Wedmore divided England between Alfred's Christian south and Guthrum's Danelaw in the north. The war was over, not because the Vikings were destroyed, but because they had been transformed. Alfred didn't stop at Edington. That's what separates him from every other medieval king who won a single great battle and then spent the rest of his reign celebrating it. He knew the Vikings would come back, not Guthrum. Guthrum kept his word and ruled East Anglia as a Christian king until his death in 890. But the Norse world was vast and hungry, and there would always be another fleet on the horizon. Edington had saved England, but only a system could keep it saved. So Alfred built one, and he constructed the Burghal System, a network of over 30 fortified towns spread across Wessex, each one positioned so that no point in the kingdom was more than 20 miles from a defensive stronghold. Each burg was garrisoned permanently. Each one had walls, gates, and a predetermined number of defenders calculated with mathematical precision. The Burghal Hidage, the document that records this system, reads like an engineering manual, not a royal decree. Every wall measured, every garrison counted, every angle of defense calculated. It was the most sophisticated defensive network in Europe since the fall of Rome. But Alfred wasn't just building walls. He was building a civilization. He reformed the legal system, creating a unified code of law that combined Saxon tradition with Christian principles. He established schools and commanded that all young men of noble birth learn to read English. He personally translated Latin texts into Anglo-Saxon, the king himself sitting at a desk with a candle, struggling through grammar and vocabulary, because he believed that a people who couldn't read their own language couldn't govern themselves. He built a navy, not by copying Viking designs, but by improving on them. His ships were larger, more stable, and designed specifically for the shallow coastal waters where Viking raiders operated. He didn't just defend against the sea, he challenged it. Was this a warrior king, a scholar king, a bureaucrat king? He was all three simultaneously, and that combination had never existed before in English history. The Vikings came back in the 890s. A massive new fleet under a warlord named Hastin tested Alfred's defenses with raid after raid. They found something they had never encountered before, a kingdom that couldn't be broken. Every attack was met by a garrison already in position. Every river approach was blocked by a burg. Every retreat was harassed by Alfred's reformed fyrd. Hastin's invasion failed, not in one dramatic battle, but in a slow, grinding frustration, as every strategy the Vikings tried was neutralized by the system Alfred had built. The raiders eventually gave up and left, not defeated in glory, defeated by infrastructure. Alfred died on October 26, 899 AD. He was 50 years old. His body had fought illness for every one of those years. The mysterious disease that had plagued him since youth never relented, never released him. Oz never gave him a single day of true physical peace. He ruled in pain. He fought in pain. He built a civilization in pain, and what he built survived. His grandson, Ethelstan, would complete Alfred's vision by conquering the Danelaw and uniting all of England under one crown for the first time in history. The kingdom that Alfred saved in a swamp became the nation that still exists today. The legal traditions he established influenced English common law for centuries. The educational system he created preserved Anglo-Saxon literature that would otherwise have been lost forever. Every English-speaking person alive today owes something to a sick man hiding in a swamp who refused to let his civilization die. The Vikings conquered 3 kingdoms. They shattered armies. They burned cities. They killed kings. They seemed unstoppable. And then they met a bookworm with a stomach ache who hadn't been supposed to rule. A man who studied their patterns the way a scholar studies texts. A man who turned defeat into strategy, humiliation into fuel, and a swamp into the launching pad for the greatest comeback in medieval history. The show gave you a side character. History gave you the man who saved England. If you want to discover more hidden legends who changed the world from the shadows, subscribe now. The real story is always more powerful than the fiction.